It was early June in 1964 when I received my assignment, right after defending my diploma in the hallway of the Moscow State Technical University. The corridor was crowded with others like me, some excited about being appointed to a regional center, while others saddened by the prospect of leaving home. I, on the other hand, was examining the yellow direction sheet in my hands, printed with the name of the Molchansky plant. My fellow student, Valera Dubček, peered over my shoulder, confirming that it was indeed somewhere in the northern part of the region. I nodded, though I had never even heard of this town before. Nevertheless, the thought of spending 3 years there as part of my assignment didn't bother me much. I had longed for independence, away from the watchful eyes of my parents. As I set off early in the morning from Moscow, taking the train in a comfortable, warm third-class carriage, I watched the countryside pass by, endless fields of sunflowers, neat villages, and sparse forests. Upon reaching the regional center, I had to transfer to a bus that rumbled along a bumpy road for about 3 hours. The passengers were few, mostly women with bags and a lone businessman with a worn-out briefcase. I dozed off to the monotonous hum of the engine, only waking up when the bus stopped at a station for my final transfer to Molchansk. Buying a soda and a fruit-filled pastry at the buffet, I sat on a bench near the bus station, the day turning out to be scorching hot, typical for early June. The usual district life unfolded around me. Grandmas selling sunflower seeds, school children running with their school bags, and a song playing faintly from a loudspeaker. As I boarded the bus to Molchansk, the first hour of the journey passed quietly, the road winding between fields and occasionally dipping into birch groves. I tried to imagine the town of Molchansk, wondering what awaited me there. Gradually, I noticed a change in the landscape outside the window. The scenery became sparser, darker, with thicker forests of spruce and pine trees whose canopies intertwined above the road, blocking out the sunlight. Across from me, a woman in a blue dress began crossing herself repeatedly. At first, I paid little attention, thinking she was just religious. But as the bus passed by isolated crosses along the road, I realized something was amiss. The absence of chirping birds and the constant buzz of the engine broke the silence. Even my transistor radio, usually a source of entertainment, picked up only static. I tried tuning the dial, but all I got was white noise. The businessman who had been dozing off behind me suddenly leaned in and whispered, "Molchansk, isn't it? On your work assignment?" He seemed about to say more, but then thought better of it. And so, as the bus rumbled on towards Molchansk, a sense of unease crept over me. Little did I know that my journey to this mysterious town would be far from ordinary. He gave me a strange look and then returned to his seat. The rest of the way, he sat hunched over his worn-out briefcase. Suddenly, the forest parted, and we emerged into the open space. In the distance, I saw a tall concrete wall stretching in both directions to the horizon. Above the wall rose typical 5-story buildings and the pipes of some industrial plant. The bus began to slow down as we approached a checkpoint, an ordinary Soviet checkpoint with a striped barrier and a guard booth. The barbed wire over the wall seemed excessive for a regular industrial facility? Something was definitely wrong here. I looked out the bus window, feeling a growing sense of unease. Dead trees, withered grass, the complete absence of any wildlife. It all felt out of place. Yes, I had been to closed research institutes during my internship, but they only had fences and a couple of checkpoints. Here, there was a concrete wall around the entire perimeter with a scorched zone around it. Maybe it was related to production. I tried to reassure myself. Perhaps some chemical emissions were affecting the vegetation, or there was radiation. After all, I had been assigned to a construction site, not a sanatorium. The bus stopped in front of the barrier, and two men in gray uniforms, without any insignia, entered the bus. One of them, carrying a folder, asked for our passports and work assignments. His voice was flat and emotionless. I handed him my documents, and he scrutinized them unnaturally long, tracing his finger over every line. His colleague stood motionless by the door, staring above our heads. The purpose of our arrival was announced in that mechanical voice again. Deployment to the instrument-making plant for a period of 3 years. He made a note in his folder and returned my documents. As the officials left, I noticed a woman in a blue dress making the sign of the cross, no longer hiding her fear. The man in the back seat, who was on a business trip, nervously tapped his foot, constantly looking out the window. The barrier lifted, and the bus drove into the city. The first thing that caught my eye was the pristine cleanliness of the streets. Not a single piece of paper, not a single cigarette butt. The pavement was meticulously swept, even though there were hardly any cars around. It was like a model Soviet city, I thought to myself, trying to brush off the uninvited sense of unease. Order, cleanliness, discipline. What was strange about that? On the contrary, I was lucky to end up in such a place. But that inner voice continued to nag at me, insisting that something was not right here. I waved away these thoughts. In the end, I was an engineer, not a paranoid old lady. Everything must have a rational explanation. The bus stopped in the square, in front of a typical bus station building. This is it," announced the driver, his first and last words to me throughout the journey. I got off the bus and looked around. It was a typical district center with a Lenin monument, a cultural center in Stalinist style, a grocery store, and a post office. But there were surprisingly few people on the streets. "Excuse me, how do I get to Builder Street?" I asked a passing woman with a shopping bag. She flinched as if I had startled her, quickly glanced around, and without lifting her eyes, she mumbled, "I don't know. I'm not from here, and I'm in a hurry." As I rushed into the grocery store, almost breaking into a run, I found it empty. The shelves were an unfamiliar sight for a Soviet store. The saleswoman wiped the counter melancholically, her hands trembling noticeably. When the bell above the door jingled, she stood up and dropped the cloth. "Excuse me," I began. I need street builders. Can you tell me the way at the end of Lenin Avenue, to the right?" She interrupted in a whisper, not looking at me. "At the 5th turn there, ask for a loaf and a pack of tea." She hurried, dropping coins, her hands shaking. On the street, I noticed a strange feature. People walked in pairs or groups, rarely alone. They hardly spoke to each other. And when someone in a gray uniform crossed their path, they fell silent. Lenin Avenue unexpectedly seemed wide and empty, patrolled only by the gray-uniformed patrols. Elderly women by the doorways quickly disappeared into the entrances upon my approach. As I turned onto street builders, I saw a playground with creaking swings, but no children in sight. Only a 10-year-old boy sat on a bench, absent-mindedly playing with a stick in the sand. When I passed by, he looked up at me with an oddly serious expression. "Are you new?" he asked softly. I nodded. "Don't stay," he said barely above a whisper. "Go away, Vitya." A frightened woman's cry came from a balcony, and the boy quickly ran into the entrance. I stood there watching him, and the swings creaked again in silence. Walking along street builders, I glanced up at the sky. The skies over Molchansk were unusually low and dense, like a leaden sheet hanging over the city. The gray mass of clouds seemed frozen, turning into a ceiling of an immense room. I didn't find it immediately, but eventually I came across a typical 5-story building. Nothing distinguished it from the neighboring houses, except for a faded sign indicating it was dormitory number 15. Near the entrance stood a bin with cigarette butts, the only disorder I had seen in the city. Inside the vestibule, the smell of bleach filled the air. Behind a glass partition sat a stern woman in a gray robe, studying my documents as thoroughly as the people at the checkpoint had. "Room 412, she finally said. "4th floor. No noise after 10 p.m. Don't bring guests." "Sign the register." I signed in the tattered journal with ink that seemed diluted with water. The elevator, of course, was not working, so I had to climb the stairs. Each floor was silent, but behind the doors I could hear muffled voices, footsteps, and the clinking of dishes. On the 4th floor corridor, I bumped into a man in his 30s carrying a kettle. When he saw me, he almost dropped it. "Excuse me," I muttered. I'm looking for room 412. I'm the newcomer." He relaxed a bit and pointed, "3rd door on the left." But before he could say anything else, a door at the end of the hallway slammed shut, and he hastily disappeared into his room. I found my door, knocked, but no one answered. I pushed the door, and inside stood 2 bunk beds. In a small room with 4 beds, 4 bedside tables, and a table by the window, a man lay on one bed with a book, while a skinny guy of about my age sat on another. "Hello," I said. They exchanged glances, and the man with the book sat up on the bed. "I'm Victor," he introduced himself. "This is Nikolai." "Nice to meet you," I nodded, not moving. I walked to an empty bed and placed my suitcase next to the window. The same faded painting by Svinkova still hung there, looking even lower and denser, with the gray rooftops of neighboring houses disappearing in its haze. "Make yourself comfortable," Victor said, putting down his book. It was a well-read book by the Strugatsky brothers, Country of Crimson Clouds. "The lower bunk is free." I started unpacking. Nikolai continued to sit on his bed, watching me. The room was filled with an eerie silence, interrupted only by the rustle of clothing and the creaking of the old bed springs. "Don't they get any reception here?" Nikolai suddenly spoke up. "Nothing but interference," Victor quickly added. "Probably due to the factory equipment." I noticed that the 4th bed was made but unoccupied. Next to it was a cup with dried tea leaves, and the 4th roommate had transferred to another city. As Victor hinted, his tone suggesting not to inquire further. "The shower is at the end of the corridor," Victor continued. "Better go in the morning before work and try to be back before dark." As footsteps approached the corridor, Nikolai tensed and quickly turned to the window. The tension in the room did not subside. "Where can I get dinner around here?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Let's go to the canteen, I'll show you." Victor got up. I'll help you deliver your documents to the HR department tomorrow. Don't go on your own, you might get lost," he added, looking at Nikolai. "I have a night shift tonight," Nikolai responded. As we stepped outside, the sky had darkened, making it seem like night had already fallen. The street rapidly emptied as people hurried home, clutching their bags and briefcases tight. Victor picked up the pace towards the canteen, and the streets quickly cleared of pedestrians. As we turned onto Lennon Avenue, which had been bustling during the day, now it looked deserted, with newspapers tumbling on the sidewalk and a distant door slamming loudly, the sound echoing strangely along the street. Suddenly, Victor grabbed my sleeve and pulled me into an alley between the buildings, whispering, "Shh." Slowly driving along the boulevard, a black Volga with its headlights off caught my eye. The silhouettes in the gray-tinted windows were barely visible as the car silently glided on the asphalt. Victor resumed our journey only after the Volga disappeared around the corner. "What was that?" I asked. "Administration," he replied after a pause. "Just a routine administrative check." We arrived at the canteen as the city was enveloped in twilight. Inside, a dim light illuminated a few people hurriedly finishing their dinner. An elderly worker in a white robe mechanically wiped the tables clean. "Cutlets with pasta," Victor said to the cashier without even looking at the menu. "2 servings of tea?" she asked in a lifeless voice. "No," he shook his head. "It's time to go home." We ate in silence, the food tasteless, but hunger overriding any complaints. Outside, the darkness deepened, and the lanterns lit up faintly, their light dim, as if seen through dirty glass. "Let's go," Victor said abruptly, getting up before finishing his meal. "They're about to close." We walked back faster, almost not speaking, the streets now empty except for the occasional patrolling police. Dimly lit Volgas passed by at intervals, and a caretaker quickly locked up the dormitory as we climbed the stairs. Back in the room, Nicholas had already left for his shift. "Let's go to sleep," Victor said, pulling the blankets. "We need to wake up early tomorrow. There are documents to be processed." Outside, in complete darkness, a car's tires barely audible against the asphalt. The morning began with a factory whistle, its monotonous sound breaking the silence. Opening my eyes at 6 a.m., I was disoriented by the gray stains on the ceiling, suggesting leaks, despite us being on the 4th floor. By then, Victor was already up, fully dressed, waiting for me. Nicholas hadn't returned from his night shift. "The factory whistle," Victor explained, noticing my confusion. "You'll get used to it. Get up. We need to have breakfast before the HR department opens." In the washroom, although deserted, People hurriedly walked along the corridor, each busy with their tasks. Cold water with a strong smell of chlorine washed over me as I looked into the mirror reflecting the same leaden sky outside. The canteen welcomed us with the same dim light as the night before, and the familiar elderly workers systematically wiped the tables just like the day before. "A manic porridge," Victor said to the cashier, ordering 2 servings. The tasteless porridge was disappointing, and I stirred the bland mixture in my bowl, trying in vain to detect any hint of sugar or salt. Victor ate quietly, lost in his thoughts. The HR department was located in an old 2-story building with columns smelling of dust and old paper. Silence filled the corridor, interrupted only by the rustling of papers and the sound of typewriters behind closed doors. The anticipation grew as people entered and exited the office with blank expressions, some lingering by the window at the end of the corridor, gazing into the distance. Finally, the door opened, and the next person was called in. Rising to my feet, I entered the office, where a woman in a strict gray suit sat behind a massive desk. Her posture and demeanor reminded me of the inspectors at the checkpoints. "Documents," she said in a steady voice. And I realized it was time to begin the bureaucratic process. She stretched out the folder with the directions, and she started sorting through the papers, trailing her long, pale finger along each line in the office, with only an occasional sigh coming from the closet on the far wall. Suddenly she said, "Excuse me, there are discrepancies in the documents. There is no such direction to the instrument-making plant in Molchansky." But how could this be? I thought to myself. I have the official distribution of directions. It can't be invalid. She neatly stacked the papers into a perfect pile. "Call in the corridor." I unfolded the direction to the Molchansky instrument-making plant. The text looked clearly printed from the Institute. Clearly distinguishable. "Administration in the building opposite the checkpoint," Victor said. "It's better not to go there. Trust me, nothing good will come of it." "Wait a bit. Look around." "But what about the distribution? I have to work for 3 years. Listen to me." Victor lowered his voice. I'm late for work. Go back to the dormitory. Just think. Don't go to the administration." And he quickly walked away, leaving me standing there with the useless direction in my hands. Unpleasant thoughts swirled in my head. How could there be no plant when there was a distribution, commission, and documents in the dormitory? I sat on the bed and started to contemplate. No plant? Clearly, Victor is not telling me something. The decision came unexpectedly. I just have to go back to Kiev, explain the situation to the Institute, get a new distribution. There must be some order in the end. I grabbed my suitcase and started packing. The bus station was open until 6. If I leave now, I can buy a ticket for the evening bus. Then I will get to the district center, and from there by train to Kiev. Quickly packed my suitcase and left the dormitory. The bus station looked exactly the same as yesterday. A typical Soviet building with columns. In the waiting room, several people sat with their bags, but no one was talking. There was a faint smell of chlorine in the air. There was no line at the ticket counter. I approached the window. "Hello. I need a ticket to the district center on the next bus," I said. The cashier looked up from her papers, her face very tired. "Departures from the city are temporarily restricted." "Why restricted?" "Quarantine," she said matter-of-factly, as if talking about the weather. "I needed to get back to Kiev. I have work, distribution. All trips are temporarily canceled. Follow the announcements." She lowered her head back to her papers. In the waiting room, people were deliberately looking in the other direction. I walked out into the square. The gray sky weighed heavily, and the factory whistle could be heard from the park, the same whistle that shouldn't exist in a city without a factory. After standing for a while, I decided to walk to the checkpoint. Maybe I could pass on foot. The way to the checkpoint took about half an hour. As I walked through the streets, I noticed that the houses were gradually disappearing, leaving more empty spaces between them. At the checkpoint, the same people in gray uniforms were on duty. When I approached, one of them raised his hand. "Your documents," he said. I handed him my passport. "The purpose of your exit beyond the perimeter?" "I need to go to the district center. Exit beyond the perimeter is temporarily restricted due to quarantine measures." "What quarantine? What is it for?" Fury welled up in my voice as the guard stared through me, as if I was an empty space. The second guard slowly placed his hand on his holster and said, "Go back to the city." Turning around, I felt their tense gazes on my back. As I returned to the dormitory, I sat on my bed sensing that something was terribly wrong. There was no factory running, yet the horns still sounded. No one had warned us about the quarantine, and Nikolai had not returned from his night shift. The sky was darkening outside, even though it was only 4 o'clock. Footsteps echoed in the hallway as someone hurried to get back before darkness fell. Victor returned to the dormitory around 7 with a sweaty briefcase in his hand. I waited for him and asked, "Where do you work?" He replied shortly, "At the station," and walked to his bed. Concerned, I inquired about Nikolai. Victor froze, still wearing his jacket. "Don't ask," he whispered. "I tried to leave today, but they say there's a quarantine. And why is the factory I was assigned to inoperable? What is happening here? You don't need to know anything." He finally turned to me. "I'll give you advice. Sit quietly. Don't ask questions. Don't try to leave. Just live as everyone else does." "But it's absurd. A non-existent factory, unknown horns, some quarantine," I protested. Victor grabbed my sleeve. His eyes filled with fear. "Shut up. They listen. They always listen," he hissed. His eyes were filled with such terror that he added in a hushed tone, "Don't leave your room at night, no matter what happens." He took out a book and lay on his bed, pretending to read. I saw his hands tremble as he listened intently to every sound in the hallway. That night, I was awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching our door. Victor sat up on his bed, his face almost ghostly pale in the darkness. 3 figures in gray uniforms stood at the threshold. "Victor Sergeyevich?" they asked. As he stood, trying to appear composed, he said, "There must be a mistake. I work at the station. Here's my pass. Come with us," they insisted. "Let me at least get dressed," Victor requested, his voice almost calm, though his hands were trembling as he reached for his shirt. "There's no need for that," one of the gray figures said, stepping forward. Victor's face suddenly changed, as if a mask of composure had cracked. "No, I won't go." He recoiled towards the window. They calmly approached him, as if it was a routine procedure. Victor darted to the corner, grabbed a chair and yelled, "I'll tell everything. I saw your factory. I saw what goes on there." One of them struck Victor's arms, causing the chair to crash. Another twisted his hands behind his back. Victor let out a long, terrifying scream of someone knowing what awaited him, something worse than death. The struggle's sounds gradually faded on the first floor. I sat on my bed, cold sweat trickling down my spine, heart pounding in my throat. The hallway fell into a dead silence, no sound coming from behind closed doors. Though I felt an inexplicable fear, I knew deep down that this was just the beginning of a nightmare. I knew that behind every corner there were people who had heard everything, who knew what was going on. But everyone prayed that today they wouldn't come for him. A car drove past the window. A few minutes later, in the night silence, the factory whistle sounded again. The same one that couldn't be in a city without a factory. Until dawn, I sat still, staring at Victor's empty bed. His last words rang in my ears, the meaning of which I couldn't grasp. And what did he see at that non-existent factory? Fear slowly gripped my insides with cold. I understood that Victor was right. We had to run, neither by bus nor through the control point. They monitored all exits from the city, so we would have to find another way. At 4 a.m., the factory whistle sounded again. I got up and walked to the window. The sky was barely beginning to lighten at this hour, and the city seemed completely empty. Patrol cars had already finished their rounds, and the cleaners had not yet started work. I grabbed a suitcase and emptied its contents onto the bed. Most of it would not be needed. I only took a warm jacket, a couple of cans of food I bought on the first day, and matches from Victor's table. In his jacket pocket, I found an old military compass with a worn glass, and his book still lay in the corridor. It was quiet. Carefully, I opened the door and looked out. There was no one on the first floor. A dim light was burning. I descended the stairs, trying not to make a sound. The TV screen flickered black and white stripes. I lingered at the door. A different world began beyond, with no documents, rules, or protection. But after what happened to Victor, I couldn't stay. I pushed the door. The hinges creaked slightly. The night watchwoman mumbled something in her sleep, but did not wake up. The morning air was thick and heavy. The empty streets, dim lanterns, and low sky were all the same as usual. But in the pre-dawn, lifeless light, I headed toward the park, keeping close to the walls of the houses. The park greeted me with bare trees and empty paths. The morning mist spread between the trunks, an unusual haze of thick white mist and unnaturally dense shadows. I walked quickly, but not hurriedly. Running could attract the attention of patrols if they were still somewhere around. There were only 300 meters to the fence. When I heard the noise of a motor behind me, I ducked behind a tree. A black Volga slowly drove down the far alley. Its headlights pierced the darkness. Frozen, I saw the fence appear in front of me. Suddenly, a gray concrete wall rose from the white haze, slightly lower than the control point and without barbed wire. Perhaps because of the proximity of the forest, the trees creeping closer. I looked around. There were no patrols, only fog and silence. I pulled myself up, gripping the roughness of the concrete with my fingers. With a scraping sound, I finally managed to grab the edge, pull myself up, and roll over the fence. On the other side was a narrow strip of land, completely bare, with no blades of grass. Beyond it, the forest began. I jumped and rolled over, hearing the cans clink in my backpack. I paused for a few seconds, listening for alarm sounds. There was no pursuit, only the wind rustling in the treetops. I shook the jacket to remove the gray dust and ran towards the forest. It was not like the forests I knew before. The trees stood unnaturally far apart, as if someone deliberately planted them at an equal distance from each other. The bark on the trunks was gray and lifeless, with branches bending at strange angles. Between them, the same whitish mist lingered, forcing me to walk slowly. Occasionally, half-rotten branches would crackle under my feet, causing me to freeze in place, listening intently. But in the forest, there was complete silence. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed unable to penetrate through these dead crowns. After a couple of hours of walking, I stopped to rest. I sat down on a fallen tree, took out a can of preserved food, and examined the forest around me. I used to go on hikes in Kiev and was familiar with nature, but here everything felt wrong. The grass beneath my feet was ashen, like sprinkled ash, and the smell in the air was a faint chemical tinge rather than the usual forest scents. As the day progressed, the mist thickened, rising higher and enveloping the tree trunks halfway up. In its swirling clouds, there seemed to be constant movement. I tried to convince myself it was just a play of light and shadow, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was getting dark, and continuing further was dangerous in such darkness. Finding a small gap between the trees, I settled in for the night, not wanting to sleep in this forest, but needing to conserve my strength. Sometime later, I was startled awake by hands grabbing me, someone pinning me down. In the darkness, I could make out several figures, dirty and ragged. Hold him," a hoarse voice hissed. "He only has a stick, not a knife." "Bring it here," another voice urged, holding something hard against my throat, smelling of unwashed bodies and fear. "You escaped this morning, climbed over the wall," the woman's voice accused. "He's lying," another voice, a man's, chimed in. "They always lie. We have to finish him." He heard us breathe heavily, asking where my backpack was. "Just by my head, don't kill me," I pleaded. They searched me, found the backpack, and rummaged through it. The rustling of paper, the smell of fresh bread surprised them. "It's really from the city," someone noted. Their grip loosened. They lifted me and leaned me against a tree. In the dim light, I could finally see them, 5 ragged figures with wild eyes, greedily devouring the bread, passing around a can of stew. "Have you been here long?" I asked, to which the bearded man who had been holding me replied, 2 or 3 days. Time moves strangely here. "I'm Stepan. This is Vera and Nikolai," he continued, gesturing to the others. "Don't speak," Vera cut him off. "He might be with them." "Who?" "From the gray ones," Stepan interjected, shrugging. Seeing my confusion, he realized I truly didn't understand what was happening. 3 years ago, it started, Stepan finally said. I was working as a guard at the power station. I noticed the birds disappearing overnight, followed by the trees withering away. And a week later, the first commission arrived in the town. Ordinary Soviet officials, Vera continued with the fields, were checking documents and writing something. We thought it was just a routine inspection, but they stayed, and others arrived, exactly the same, taking over the administration building, the police station, the post office. Their people were everywhere. I was the first to notice that there was something off about them. Stepan spoke softly, looking at the ground. I had the night shift, was doing my rounds, and I saw one of them. He thought he was alone in the courtyard of the police station. While I stood behind the transformer booth, he fell silent, clenching his fists. What did you see? I asked. They wear human faces like masks, literally, he shrugged. You know, I've seen all sorts of things on the front, but nothing like this. And then people started disappearing. A thin man sitting to the side spoke up. At first, individuals vanished, then entire families. They all mentioned transfers to other facilities, business trips, but no one ever returned. And as for the factory, they use people as food. Stepan spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. They keep them in those workshops like cattle on a farm. Why the town of Molchansk, far from the center, rarely visited? Who comes here? And mostly a secret facility nearby. Everyone's used to this being a restricted zone, a closed city. Documents, passes, restrictions. But why? Vera grimaced bitterly. We wrote letters, made phone calls, but all leads went cold. It's as if the town simply vanished from the map. Even the relatives of those who lived here suddenly forgot about us or pretend to forget, ignoring the call of the horn every morning and evening. It's not a horn, Stepan said quietly. It's them, feeding when their numbers grow too many. They can't contain their true form. Then the whole town is shrouded in some kind of haze, and that sound, those are their real voices. We fell silent in the forest. Dead silence, no birds, no wind, just the mist curling among the trees. And why didn't you leave earlier? I asked. At first, we didn't understand what was happening, and when we did, it was too late. They control all the exits of the town. They have their network, their people, or those who pretend to be people. They watch, eavesdrop, report. Each passing day their numbers grow, Vera added. They spread like a plague across the town, taking over apartments and houses, looking like ordinary people, but if you look closely, somewhere in the distance, everything freezes. Now I heard something new in that sound, a low, vibrating tone that made my hair stand on end, as if a huge creature was approaching. A patch of light flickered to the right. Dogs started barking. Run, Vera shouted. I sprinted into the darkness, cries and footsteps echoing behind me. The beam of a spotlight caught me and blinded me. I stumbled, fell, and rolled down a slope into a small ravine filled with fog. As I regained my senses, I saw silhouettes in front of me, the chain of figures in the form of chains merging in a blur. With methodical pace, the massive dogs chased through the forest behind them, their unnaturally elongated muzzles twisted in a bloodthirsty thirst. One of the pursuers stopped right above me in the dim light, his face looking like a wax mask. He turned his head to sniff the air and quickly darted towards a sound. I lay still, hidden somewhere in the shadows. Then, a long and horrifying scream echoed in the distance, followed by another. I recognized Vera's voice in the second scream. The shrill cries abruptly fell silent. I remained motionless until dawn broke. As the first light began to seep through, I cautiously emerged and scanned my surroundings. On the ground, I noticed dark patches. As I drew closer, I recoiled. It was human blood. Tangled in the undergrowth lay a torn sleeve from Stepan's jacket. I trudged on, driven by desperation. When my legs threatened to give way, I leaned against a tree to rest, a gnawing fear constantly lurking in my mind that they were on my trail. In the pre-dawn glow, a figure in a gray suit materialized like a phantom among the trees. I tried to find something edible in the barren forest, but there was no sign of life, no berries, no mushrooms, not even insects, only the gray withered grass beneath my feet and the eternal mist weaving among the trees. At night, the distant whistles haunted me, echoes from the city. Occasionally, the beams of searchlights flickered on the horizon, and I cowered under fallen trees, gripping with fear. I heard the distant howls of the dogs, but they seemed far off. On the third day, hallucinations from hunger and exhaustion began to plague me. In the mist, I saw images of myself, and then, on the fourth day, something shifted. I couldn't immediately pinpoint what it was. Eventually, I noticed that breathing had become easier and the mist started to thin. Gradually, snippets of the real sky peeked through the gray clouds. An hour later, I spotted green moss on a tree, normal moss found in ordinary forests. When I touched it, it was alive and moist. Then, I heard a common chirping of a tit bird. Nothing extraordinary, but I stopped and listened, captivated by its melody. By evening, I had completely left the dead zone behind me. The transition was so evident, as if a line had been drawn. The gray trunks and unnatural mist were a memory, replaced by the rustling of a living forest, ferns underfoot, butterflies fluttering above the flowers, and ants scurrying on tree bark. I fell to my knees in the grass. It smelled like ordinary grass, with a fresh, green aroma that overwhelmed me after the sterile emptiness of the dead forest. I plucked some leaves and chewed on them. Sorrel, then sorrel again. Never before had simple grass tasted so delicious to me. In the vibrant forest, I finally found the courage to fall asleep, truly and deeply. I nestled in a hollow beneath a sprawling fir tree. My dreams were hazy, filled with gray figures and distorted faces, interrupted by distant whistles. I awoke to the cold of deep night and heard the distant rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. At first, I thought it was another hallucination, but the sound persisted. Somewhere in the darkness, A train approached. I stumbled towards the sound, my legs barely holding me up from exhaustion. The world darkened before my eyes, but I pressed on, allowing myself to pause for only a few minutes. After about 40 minutes, the forest parted before me. There it was, the railway embankment. The rails stretched into the darkness. They were real, glinting faintly. In the distance, a dim light appeared as a freight train crawled up the incline, its wheels grinding heavily against the tracks. Summoning the last shreds of my strength, I ran alongside the train tracks. The train was moving slowly, making it difficult to catch up. My legs were wobbly. A sharp pain was piercing my side. Finally, I managed to grab onto a protruding piece of metal, pulled myself up, and tumbled over the side of the coal carriage. I fell and lay there for a long while, gasping for air. A week later, I returned to Kiev after my escape. I looked so terrible that my mother burst into tears when she saw me at the doorstep, while my father silently poured vodka. The next day, I went to the militia station. The duty officer listened to my story, made notes in a protocol, then made a call and said to come back in 3 days. After 3 days, I was informed that the town of Molchansky did not exist. I went to the institute, found my course in the archives, a blank sheet without a stamp or signature. The secretary in the distribution department couldn't remember where exactly I was supposed to be sent. I wrote to the regional prosecutor's office and received a response stating that the said settlement was not listed in the region. I even wrote to the newspaper sparking interest, but the correspondent who was sent returned after a week, saying he could only get as far as the district center as the road beyond was washed out. I tried to find families of other escapees, but all the addresses I remembered turned out to be false. It was as if someone was methodically erasing any traces of the city and its inhabitants. One day, I unfolded a map of the region in front of my father, where Molchansky should have been. Maybe you should see a doctor a month after coming back, he suggested. That's when I noticed the surveillance. A man in a gray suit at the bus stop, a black Volga slowly passing by the institute. They weren't in a hurry, just letting me know that they knew where I was. I saw that car near my building. They found me, which is why I'm writing this letter. If you're reading this, it means they've taken me. I don't know who you are or how this letter reached you, but please, don't try to investigate anything. Do not search for the town of Molchansky. I can already hear footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, approaching my floor. Farewell. P.S. Document found in declassified KGB archives. Details of the discovery are unknown, and the author's identity could not be determined. Town of Molchansky.